welcome to the BPL at DPE Summit 2024. I don't even know which year we're in anymore. And with me today, we have Inez from Block. So I'm just going to get you to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Inez. I work at Block. I work for the mobile developer experience team. I'm focused mostly on Android experience.
Cool. So the reason I really wanted to talk to you is because someone said that you were interested in flaky tests. So I really want to know about your experience with flaky tests.
Right. Flaky tests and unreliable builds in general are a big problem for us at Square. It's something that we've been working on for more than a year probably now. We made a huge progress. Interesting thing about this problem is that in a way, it's agnostic to a repo. So we have this problem in our Android repo, on our iOS repo, our Java, Go, JavaScript repos. So there is like a set of solutions that apply to all those repos. But then also in each repo, because there are different technology stacks and so on, you also need like very custom solutions that go for each of those technologies separately, which makes it challenging because you don't know if you should go wide or deep.
Right. So I'm kind of interested. So I have a thing about flaky tests, and my thing is I freaking hate them. But when I'm trying to talk to people about flaky tests, obviously people want to fix them. I hope they want to fix them. So I'm kind of interested in your flaky tests. Are they? So you've mentioned Android. So I know that things like end-to-end tests and emulator tests and things which are kind of and device tests and things have a tendency towards being a bit more flaky than a fast-running JUnit test.
That's right.
Is that your experience, or is it that just tests can be flaky across the board, and it's, like you say, different problems cause flakiness in different types of tests?
Yeah, definitely our experience being most problematic with Android UI tests, as you said. And they are the most flaky for us. So we know that our unit tests are also flaky, but that's kind of like waiting on the list of, maybe in the future, because UI tests are so flaky that it's still a big problem that unit tests, by comparison, are just not a problem at this point.
Right. So what causes the flakiness in the UI test? Is it because you have to wait for stuff to come up, or is it because it's difficult to test the UI? Is it because of things like screen resolution, or like what causes the problems?
Yeah, good question. So actually that thinking of what is causing flakes brought us to thinking of what we call reasons for flakiness. And that's made us also start looking for common reasons of flakiness. So a lot of existing tooling currently for looking at the test data and analyzing flakiness, it's looking from the perspective of a single test name, like or class name and the test name. And that's definitely very helpful to know what's the flakiness for a single test or for a single class. But when we started looking for the common reasons based on the stack trace, so how the test fails and what's in that stack trace, we had to normalize it. There's a lot of UUIDs and other non-deterministic values. After we normalized for it, we discovered that actually a lot of tests are failing for the same reasons that are hidden somewhere either in our infrastructure or in our robots. We use the robot pattern for our UI tests. So that's actually just shifting that view, like not look at the individual tests, but look at the ways in which things fail, allowed us to make a huge improvement and identify basically number of those reasons.
Right, so that's really interesting because I was looking at, so I'm currently writing a training course about troubleshooting tests, and there's a whole section on flaky tests, which is why I'm really interested in this topic. And using Develocity to identify flaking tests, you can see your flakiest test and you can see its passing rate and you get a sense for the flakiness. So you can dive in and have a look at that test and why it's flaky. But what I really wanted to see was what you just said, like, okay, this test is flaky and it's very flaky, but like what is the most common cause of flakiness? Is it like, my example in the past would have been things like waiting for an element ID on an HTML thing, or is it something perhaps infrastructural like a network connection? And so that's kind of what you've been doing. You've been looking at what the error is and how many tests are suffering from the same kind of error.
Right. Yeah, so we had a number of things that we solved. Like occasionally something comes back. Like for instance, there were problems with closing database, SQLite, but that caused a big problem. We fix it and it goes away. But I think the one that is keeps coming and going back is finding the elements on the screen. We noticed that a lot of those things are application performance related. So we had like interesting case where actually increasing performance, like making application run faster, was causing problems.
Okay.
So those were very interesting to tackle. It's this thing in the Android when you have a tap event. It's actually an action down and then it's an action up, but they have to happen on the exactly same element. If the element is swapped in between, even with the same looking element, then it doesn't register it as an action tap, and then there is user interaction does not occur. So it's very interesting because it actually showed a problem in our application. Like if it runs too fast, we re-render too much, which we shouldn't if it looks the same. But yes, that's our biggest problem, is that there might be some feature flags that modify how application behaves, or something is not deterministic. There are some upsell banners or pop-ups that are not always expected. So we are trying to now go more into like how people are writing tests, not only the infrastructure, to create like set of good, solid recommendations to make it easy for people to write tests. One area that we are still exploring is that actually decent amount of test is spent on configuring the test, so getting into the known state, and then just testing, assessing whether it's the correct state. So you're trying to figure out the right balance of creating APIs for that, so people can go to known state really quickly and then only assess. So kind of things that are really like pretty easy in unit test, but somehow they not necessarily made it to the UI testing world just yet.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the challenges of the end-to-end and the UI tests in particular,
Yeah.
isn't it? Like if you want to test, I don't know, 3 screens in, like you have to do login and then navigate,
Right.
and then so if login fails, all of your tests fail, and yeah, so finding those good patterns for being able to ignore the path to where you want to be and just focus on just the thing
Right.
you're trying to test must be important for reducing flakiness on the way to where you want to get.
Right.
So yeah, any thoughts?
I mean, we are. So yes, just exposing APIs. So we want to login flow, of course, test that. So we currently, actually, that was the first thing that we extracted, just to have a login test separately, and then all the other tests go into login state by default. We just have to do more of it. But we are trying to lean more and more into avoiding running UI tests when it's not necessary. For unit tests, it's much easier. There are a couple of solutions how to do that. For UI tests, it's more tricky, but that's something that we started exploring, and we saved quite a lot of time, like about 25% of the tests we don't run currently that before we used to run. But we think we can bring that number down even more by identifying which tests are relevant for certain changes based on the Git diff. So that doesn't exactly solve for the flakiness problem, but it just make retrying much less expensive, and also like if something is not run, it doesn't have that, it cannot flake really. So that's kind of what we are going towards, and also establishing like what kind of flakiness is acceptable, because I think everyone accepts that very flaky test, whatever it means, that's not what we want. But also everyone accepts that they're probably not going to be like 100% stability. So we are working on figuring out what's the right threshold for that.
That's really interesting, because like one of my pieces of advice for addressing flaky tests is try not to have end-to-end tests, try not to have UI tests. Obviously, realistically speaking, especially if you're working on an Android app, for example, you want to be able to check that the screens work. But like my advice is usually, and bearing in mind I don't work in this area, I'm just thinking theoretically, like you shouldn't need to, it's very tempting to test everything end to end. Because what you want to do is you want to go to the app and you go here and you log in here and you do that, and you can visualize that and you can see that for like every workflow. But my theory is that in theory, you shouldn't need to do that for everything. You can do it for like happy path, but if you really want to check a lot of edge cases, you want to push that down a little bit and do unit tests, or at least not full end-to-end UI tests. So do you have any kind of like guidance or ideas in terms of, you said trying to reduce the amount of UI tests and things, like how do you decide which things need to be full end-to-end and which things perhaps you can test at a unit level or at least separated from the UI?
Yeah, so we are actually trying to overall encourage our developers to write UI tests, and generally they do write UI tests. Like when they create a new feature, it by default comes with new UI tests. It's more that we don't want to run the tests that are not related to their changes. And with our number of developers, and we have monorepo with a couple of products. There's Square Point of Sale, there's appointments, invoices, retail, restaurants, a couple more, and they work together. So basically the number of combinations is really high, and then for every of those, we call them verticals, you have feature flags, which are constantly being changed, right? There are constantly new features being added and removed. So we are kind of like figuring out we haven't found a better way than actually test end-to-end flows with different feature flags and making sure that just nothing breaks on the way. We think we're actually going to be adding more of the production tests to talk to production, at least for the core workflows, like the things that cannot fail, which in our case, like mostly the payment and the checkout flows.
Yeah. That's interesting. So you do testing in production as well? Is that what you're saying?
Oh, we started. Yes, we started, and we most likely gonna expand on that. Yeah, but it's not yet very well established. We are kind of like experimenting with it right now.
So I went and gave a presentation to a company I used to work for actually, and they were also presenting on their testing strategy. And one of the things they do is testing in production. Yeah. So they kind of put events through production, like flagged as test events, and then they can like not spend that money.
Right.
But like it seems kind of scary, I think, for people, the idea of testing, especially financial stuff, testing money stuff in production.
Yeah.
But if you're working on a system which depends on money going the right way, surely the only way to really make sure it's going to work is to do tests in production.
Right, and I think like it's to clarify, it's I think testing on production is for the sort of a smoke test, but it's mostly because it seems like other approaches are not giving necessarily good results. Like when you test on staging can be down, right? And you kind of want to be okay with the fact that different teams can occasionally bring staging down. Like you want them to take risks, and sometimes that comes with like bringing staging down for a couple of minutes or a couple of hours. And production has to be reliable. It has SLAs. So we are experimenting with that. Today, I think folks from Uber, it's kind of interesting because they're also like looking into it around the same time.
No, it's cool. I think people are sort of terrified of the idea of testing in production, but that's kind of somewhere you really want to make sure that environment is working. It's one of the most important.
Yeah,
so
I guess like just to clarify, it's important that it's not like testing, like outsourcing the testing to end user, right? Because I think that's what testing in production sometimes mean. Like you're not testing and you're just waiting for the crashes.
Right.
Yeah, versus like testing using a production backend. Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to ask you about the other side of that. So we've gone sort of like end-to-end and UI and even production testing. But you mentioned that there's flakiness in even like back-end tests and Java tests and things like that. So I think people are kind of comfortable with the idea that integration tests and end-to-end tests will be naturally flaky. Like you mentioned, there's a certain level of flakiness we're probably going to need to be comfortable with. But when it comes to things like unit tests and more unit tests, do you think that it's okay to have flakiness there as well, or do you think that's something that could be eliminated at some point?
Yeah, so I'm kind of like on a stronger belief that unit tests should not be flaky, and I try to encourage team and people I work with to usually chase the root cause and don't put workaround. Like for the things that should be deterministic, and we kind of have full end-to-end control over that. So I think like we don't want to accept flakiness in unit tests. Currently we do, but it's only because there is like so little of that flakiness, and basically like the priorities are elsewhere. And unfortunately for the UI test, it's different story, right? Because you are running on the Android system, and there is so much happening. Like that device is so chatty. There is so much. Like if you inspect the log cut at the time of running test, there is so much other activity that you just feel like borderline not fair to ask developer to have this perfect stability, because there is so much going on that they do not control.
Yeah. So when it comes to things like unit tests, which I kind of agree with you, I think unit tests should not be flaky. What sort of things do you find causes flakiness in unit tests? Is it in the test code? Is it the production code? Is it the infrastructure? Or is it something else?
Yeah. For us, I think it's probably the typical thing, like the dealing with dates or not, realizing that basically like using things that not mocking correctly, or mocking certain date and checking whether 1 year has passed, and then like 1 year passes and all of a sudden you have a bunch of it's more like, I guess, failures than flakes. But we had this I think everyone at this point had like this tests that work only certain time of the day due to different time zones. So we have mostly those kind of problems for unit tests, as I'm aware.
I'm really happy to hear you say that, because like date and time is so difficult, and it's so difficult for tests. We tend to assume like, well, I know how to tell the time. It's kind of easy to write a test for it, but like time zones. So I used to work in London, so for 6 months of the year you're on UTC, and then when we get daylight savings time, suddenly you're on a completely different time zone, and anything that you had set to UTC no longer works. It's like date and time is just, it's just really tricky. One of the ways we used to get around it is we actually, in our application, instead of relying on the system clock, we had a clock service, and then you could like stub that out so that you can do tests like let's time travel forward to close of day, or let's see what happens if we roll over the end of the year, because you can stub out the time service itself. But yeah, like date and time is just, it's just hard. Yeah,
it's kind of interesting because in this case, the solutions are relatively straightforward, I would say. It's just making sure that people are using those solutions, right? And maybe something we could solve with linting and static analysis of the code or of the pull request in the future.
I also think that there's a fly going around here. It's driving me crazy. I think it's also fairly easy for us as developers to kind of blame the infrastructure that runs the tests. Like if the infrastructure changes, or if it's kind of like overloaded or anything like that. Do you see anything like that where the environment that's running the tests is causing some of the flakiness?
Not so much. We put a lot of effort to build the infrastructure that is stable, very predictable in terms of load. We use the bare metal instances just to make sure that there is no one else that we are competing with on that machine for the CPU or for the memory. I guess mostly for the CPU. We use the NVMe drive, so the same thing, to not compete for the network bandwidth for the hard drive. So I don't think we see much of infra problems. It's mostly within the test. We're exploring, and in some repositories we're doing that, to run stability jobs every nightly, essentially every fixed duration of a time. So when there is a new flaky test and the developer is looking at the new flaky test, to make sure that we have a data for them to present, like, hey, this actually been stable, or that's what the stability looked like the night before. So they don't have to basically question whether it's actually a test or was there an infra problem. And we do retries too. I mean, of course, we depend on the retries, which is interesting because it lets us hide the perceived reliability of the build, but it comes with the downside that people are sometimes making things more flaky without really realizing that, and that's a relatively big problem for us, that we just constantly have new flaky tests. It's something that we're working on now to stabilize the situation, basically reduce the pace or the number of new flakes being added, and then once that slows down, once that's done, Then we want to expand more on actually maybe creating a small team that will be tasked with going after flaky tests and fixing them, but providing them with really good tools to do it in an efficient manner.
Yeah, I think that this kind of touches on one of the things that I hate about flaky tests. Once you have flaky tests, they just kind of seem to breed more flaky tests, right? Like it's because everyone accepts there's a certain level of flakiness, and if I introduce a new test and it's a bit flaky, well, that's just kind of a thing because we have flaky tests. So in order to try and aim for no flaky tests, which I don't think is really realistic, but you want to aim for no flaky tests so that new tests should not be flaky, right? Like that should be an absolute no-go.
Yes. So I really like this metaphor of the broken windows, right? So I really would like to reduce the number of those broken windows. So when new developers come to work on the product, they actually see a good standard and low amount of flaky tests, so they don't copy and carry the same problems.
Yeah.
The problems in the implementation for that are those mentioned before common reasons of flakiness, which are, they're not on the core infrastructure like where the tests run, but those are things within the application that cause maybe a lot of tests to be very, very little flaky. But then when the test flakes, sometimes you don't know whether you're actually doing something wrong or it's a pre-existing reason and you were just very unlucky. So we are also looking for that, not only whether the test is flaking for the first time, but whether it's flaking for the first time for a particular reason, right? So hopefully we'll be able to tell developers that this was a flaky test, and it's still a flaky test, but now you're introducing new reason of flakiness, for instance, right?
Right. Yeah, so I think that's really key. Like, the first step with flaky tests is knowing that you have flaky tests, right? A lot of people don't even realize some of their tests are flaky. But this is the thing that you've been talking about. Like, if you can get to a root cause of the flaky test, then you can understand, did we make it flakier in a different dimension, or did we make it worse, or is it just, we just have this kind of level of flakiness, which is kind of fine,
Yeah.
So like a flakiness classification. And then you can address some of those problems. And then this kind of leads to something else I would like to talk about with flaky tests. This is one of my favorite topics. But it's easy to assume that flakiness is caused by infrastructure, or it's a UI test, or it's a test problem, or it's date and time. But something that you just said is that fundamentally it could be a production code problem. The flakiness could be something in the application. And it's so difficult, I think, to track down those things without understanding the causes of flakiness, without being on top of reducing test flakiness so you can identify actual application flakiness.
Right.
So I think the reason why addressing flaky tests is so important is because it could be a race condition in your production code. It could be a real problem. It's not just, these tests are just flaky.
Yeah, I think that's where that struggle that I mentioned at the beginning is whether we should focus on one repo or maybe even one product, and so basically go deep and make sure, for instance, we don't have any or very little flakiness for Android product, or going wide and tackling it for multiple repos. But then it means that we're gonna be providing tooling, mostly data visibility, but leaving it up to teams to figure out what to do about those things. One thing that I think will drive a significant shift is to give developers that information about introducing flakiness at the time when it's very actionable, which is at the pull request time. A lot of tooling needs some data to catch up, for PR to be merged, for the test to run a couple times, and then the tool starts showing okay, there's new test that is flaky and it's high flake rate. And we're working on solutions to detect it early on. So developers are either there's a comment on the pull request or maybe a Slack message whenever there is a detection of that situation, so they can address it right away. We started using a little bit of LLMs to try to analyze our code. Here's the diff of a change the developer is making. There's a code and basically flake rate of the test before and after. We are trying to use LLMs to figure out if they can try to identify the reason what about that code could be non-deterministic or not predictable that would cause the flakiness. And sometimes those tools are very, very good. Yeah.
Sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah.
Okay, so I do want to wrap this up, especially because we brought it nicely full circle around finding the flakiness in the different repos and stuff. But I mean, to put words into your mouth, I think the first thing about flaky tests is understanding that you have flaky tests and then being able to identify them. But then what I love about what you've been doing is this idea of being able to figure out the root cause and see that across all of everything. Because otherwise you can't do anything without some visibility over these things.
Yeah, that's right. And I like to add to that, I think it's a little bit also about teaching developers or encouraging them for the, having empathy mainly for the developers, and realizing how annoying are the flaky tests, and then how it expands elsewhere. I think developers, they see flakes in the CI, but then they would retry right away before going to investigate the reason, because they're used to retry helping. But then they seem to apply it also to different parts of the CI. So I think that's another benefit of fixing it. When you can trust those results, I think it generally teaches you or shows that you can generally trust the CI results.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing about flaky tests, is it erodes the trust in your test and in your code. So that's why you need to fix your flaky tests.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great pleasure.